Hello, and welcome to Markets in Focus. My name is Joe Bell, and today I'm going to walk you through some of the most interesting financial market themes that I'm observing. So the markets have drawn down. The S&P 500 peak back on January 3rd. You have to go all the way back to November to find the peak for small cap and mid cap stocks. But since January 3rd, the bulk of this strong volatility, we've seen ETF fund flows go into value and financial ETFs as interest rates go higher. Inflation, that's been the big worry last year and continues to be a concern. Obviously, the Fed expected to start raising rates this year. But when you look at some of the expectations surveys, consumers actually perhaps seeing a peak around the corner for inflation during this year. And then finally, US fiscal policy. This is something we've talked about, a longer term theme. We've had record amounts of fiscal stimulus related to the pandemic. Well, most of that's expired, perhaps higher taxes in the near term. Latest expectations out of economic policy forums are showing that an expectation for GDP growth to be pushed down by fiscal policy, a big difference than the past couple of years. Now let's take a look at those ETF fund flows. This is since January 3rd. That is the peak for the S&P 500. You can see the total in millions of dollars in or out of respective ETFs. And you can see at the top there, we've seen value factor ETFs, financial sector, and commodities. Some of the commodities perhaps related to interest rates and inflation. Value and financial related to the big surge in interest rates. So that makes sense. And on the flip side, we've seen a rotation out of small cap stocks, out of those growth stocks that still led, even though we had a pretty strong increase in interest rates during 2021, growth in tech actually still performed pretty well, but that hasn't been the case during this drawdown where value is outperforming. We're seeing those flows go out of growth, and long duration bonds is the big one that's continued to get hit hard as the yield curve starting to flatten. Longer term rates are going up as well as short term rates. Now, in terms of inflation, obviously, we're at the highest level since the 1980s. The big question is, when are we peaking? Have we peaked? Many people starting to perhaps say that if we haven't, it's right around the corner here soon over the next couple of months. And if you look at the New York Fed survey of consumer expectations, that is the case as well. If you look at 1 year ahead, 5.8%, 3-year annualized rate of 3.5%. If you go out to the bond market, not charted here, expectations based on the break-evens between inflation-adjusted treasuries and treasuries forecast a 5-year growth rate of below 3%. So consumers and the bond market expecting lower inflation than we're currently seeing. And perhaps we've reached that peak that I talked about, that everybody's wondering just when that's going to occur. And then finally, longer term theme, something we've been talking about, perhaps is going to start weighing on the economy. We'll see how that impacts the stock market in the coming months and years. But just looking from an economic perspective, obviously we had the record amounts of fiscal stimulus during the heart of the pandemic, and quantitative easing has become the norm since the financial crisis in terms of monetary policy. On the fiscal side of things, big spending by the government as well, and that's been supportive in terms of the massive amounts of spending, consumer demand, and then overall net worth improvement over the past year or so. Most of those have expired. And if you look at the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy forecasting out potential fiscal policy drag as those expirations go away, as we see less government spending relative to potential increases in taxes with the record amount of debt that we have. So perhaps some of those tailwinds for the stock market are going away here in the coming years. Now, finally, I want to thank everyone for watching, and we've got a good story. It goes across from New Hampshire, east coast of the US, all the way to the far east, if you will, Norway, up northeast there. We had a boat created by young students in New Hampshire, middle school students, launched it into the ocean and traveled more than 8,000 miles. More than a year and a half later, a Norway student found the boat. So pretty awesome creation, pretty nice project to see that the winds have taken it across the continent. And apparently, if you launch it from New Hampshire, it takes about a year and a half before the boat will arrive. So congratulations to those students. Pretty neat story. With that, I want to thank everyone for watching, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.